The following document was discovered and obtained during a dredging excavation of a riverbed in rural Michigan. The document was written with an orange, rust-like substance on ordinary paper by an unknown individual. It was preserved by way of a human skull. That is, the document was rolled and lodged within the recovered remains. Nothing has been able to be identified as belonging to any missing persons, and the contents of the scroll document remains equally perplexing. As far as analysts are concerned, it derived from another world. This is the written account below. After falling asleep last night, I awoke in a drastically altered dreamscape that felt all too real. It appeared as though the apocalypse had finally happened, because the sky was the color of rust, a deep orange-tinged cover blanketing the atmosphere. I was in an alley. It was run down, barren, and dilapidated. In fact, everything was. There wasn't a single discernible thing left standing. Buildings were halved, now mostly rubble, and an undertone of orange lightly dusted every crumbled brick. Behind me was a chain-link fence that stretched far too high for me to climb safely, and ahead of me seemed to be a street, although it was broken and cracked. My legs weren't working. I wasn't sure of the reason, but I was forced to crawl. My hands grazed crushed glass, concrete, and other debris as I made my way to the entrance of the alleyway. However, I did not feel the pain. As far as I was aware, I was the only thing left standing. Alive, that is. The only sound to be heard was the gentle breeze that wisped its way through the devastating upheaval. It carried with it more of the dust, and I had to cover my eyes so that it wouldn't blind me. It was hard to breathe, too. The air was heavy with the ceaseless death that I imagined was lying in wait for me the moment I reached the end of that narrow alley. When my bleeding hands had dragged me to the brink, I saw it. The senseless destruction of a world laid to waste, complete and total desolation. But then, the obtrusively dominant sound of whips cracking and chains rattling was carried on the wind past my innocent ear. As I turned my head to the direction of the sound, I was met with a sight of pure anguish. Humanity enslaved. There were several rows of people walking with their hands and feet bound by leather. Behind them were their oppressors. However, I could not begin to describe them accurately because I had never seen anything like them before. If I could hazard a guess, I would describe them as towering, black, silken-robed entities wielding all manners of tools and weapons seemingly only for the purpose of torture. Their faces bore no features, that is, none that I could see, because the shadows cast by their hoods of grandeur obscured my curiosities. Their presence alone was like the weight of the world had fallen upon my shoulders, truly insurmountable. One unfortunate soul tried to escape, but the masters, I'll call them, prevented their exodus. There was a flash of light before the leg of the individual was shot to shreds, but no noise accompanied the attack. Silent killers in their right, the conquerors of our once beautiful planet. Still, the blood being spilled did not mar the overwhelming orange hue that had wormed its way through everything and all. A horn sounded from somewhere nearby, followed by various shouts in a language I couldn't understand, and I doubted I was going to find out either. By some miraculous divine act, I regained mobility in my legs and clambered to my feet, careful not to draw attention to myself. I wasn't seen, fortunately, and I remained hidden against the wall of the alley as the parade of doom passed me by. Perhaps because this was a dream, I could not be seen at all by anything. I was sure that one of the humans would falter and look in my direction, but none did. It seems that even in the apocalypse, one can remain inconspicuous. I wasn't certain what my next move should be. This foreboding world of demise and dismay held no hope for salvation amongst any of the previously glorious buildings. But there was one that was still standing. It was a 2-story apartment building, or so it seemed. As I approached the building, another horn sounded out with a resonating trumpet-like cacophony of abrasive and dissonant sounds. When I surveyed the area, I noticed a regiment of the Reaper-esque beings heading my way. I had only made it halfway across the cobbled streets, and I knew I wouldn't make it to the building in time. My only option was to hurl myself down an open manhole into the wretched sewer below. Once down there, I heard the trampling and heavy footsteps of my pursuers pass overhead. The ground shook as they did, and bits of rubble fell onto my head, but they were small and ineffective. There was no light down here, and I would find no shelter amongst the sewer cylindrical tunnels. I would need to either climb back up and take my chances with those ruthlessly aggressive marchers of death, or find another way here in the sewer. The world above made my decision for me, because more footsteps came and went, with looming shadows being cast down the ladder. It would not be wise to climb back up at this moment, unless, of course, I was seeking my annihilation, which I was not. Being forced to wander the darkened sewer tunnels teetered on the edge of what you might consider less than ideal. Although the choice was not made lightly, the presence down here was one of agony, lost hope, dreams created and then destroyed. It was sadness and sorrow, the empty and the nothing. As I used my hand to guide my way through this unexpected pilgrimage, I began to hear faint signs of life. Flesh was shifting somewhere in the dark, but I could not see it. Were I in founded reality, I would have turned around. But this was a dream, and therefore I pressed on without hesitation. That's when the flesh became visible. The amalgam of bodies coalescing with one another before me struck my core with great intensity. The reds and pinks were vibrant, along with intertwining tendons of white, and the dried blood trail underneath the mass of humanity painted a gruesome picture. Torches adorning the walls were now lit, and the flames danced on the flesh like a wicked performance not found anywhere else. Their bodies were crying, some were screaming, some groaning in painful ecstasy. What could I do for them? I was naught but a witness to their pitiful existence, pathetic and rendered down to frail remnants of their former selves. But their arms, their bleeding hands reached for me. They called out, "Save us!" I shook my head and responded, "I cannot. I am not your savior. I'm afraid your forms have gone farther than any power I have could possibly revert." The mass slid towards me. "Then join us." "I will not!" I shouted back, but their foul grip reached me from places beyond my view. For, unbeknownst to me, the mass was not alone. This sewer was crawling with the husk of humanity, perhaps the undesirables, or those that the ones above deemed unwanted. More answers I did not have. With little effort, I managed to remove myself from their grasp. Their groans continued like a chorus of demonic spirits. It was unbearable. But they would not stop, so I started backing away. "Help us," they said, like a being with many voices. Voices that would seek the addition of my blood to theirs. "No, I cannot. I am not from this world. You must fend for yourselves and leave me to my journey." "Are you not?" asked the mass while it continued to follow my retreat. "Am I not what? Who are you to speak of my inaccuracies?" I retorted with vehement condemnation. "This world is yours, as it is ours," answered the mass. "No, I refuse!" I shouted in response as I faced away from the visage of possible things to come and returned to the ladder, ascending into the dusty orange-colored world above. I let my eyes peer over the edge of the entrance to the sewer shaft. There didn't appear to be any more adversaries, and for reasons unknown to me, that same building was like a compelling beacon begging for my presence. But the mass had reached me. Their plethora of arms raked the skin of my ankles as they attempted to drag me back down into their horrid depths. "No!" I commanded, with a voice quickly growing hoarse. "You will join us. You will accept the truth," said the mass in a dubious hiss. The low glow from the surface illuminated the decomposing body parts that made up its grotesque flesh. It was an image that was forever burned into my mind. I kicked and flailed, trying my best not to let go of the ladder. It would mean my death if I did. That thought gave me the strength I needed to find victory. I was once again able to free myself from the mass and seek reprieve on the ground above. The familiar cracked road felt like home when faced with the opposition below, but the harsh reminders around me kept my intuition from being deceived. The mass carried on with their proclamations of doom and of how I belonged with them, but I ignored it. No longer would I allow the voices of the past to enter my mind so unrestricted unless they offered wisdom of which the mass did not. Despite my setback with the tunnels below, I made it to the sole standing building. There was no sign of those exterminators of humanity, which meant I was in luck. A flock of unrecognizable flying creatures flew through the air above. Their wings were laden with holes, but they maintained flight regardless. However, during my distracted lapse, a snarl came from behind me. I spun around, but in the throes of time slowed to see a beast with many eyes, bearing wicked fangs dripping with the vicious malice. The seething maw stalking its way around me carried with it a fetid poison that oozed like a blistering acid. I couldn't let that touch me, lest it enter my veins and corrupt my body like some necrotic venom. It watched my every movement, a hunter and its prey. For a dream, I didn't feel like I had much control over what was happening. It was like I was a puppet experiencing a premonition of the end of days. The beast growled fiercely and rose on its hind legs before clawing the air in an attempt to strike my face, but I stepped back, out of its reach. Once again, I was forced to retreat. It would seem that something wanted to prevent me from going into that building. I became like a rat, scurrying through the abandoned streets, trying to avoid the rapidly advancing dog-like beast. Its roar was like a lion's, but its body was like a wolf's. Perhaps it had been transformed by some type of radiation? Whatever the reason, one fell swoop of its razor-thin claws would surely kill me, if not maim me to the point of incapacitation. I discovered an old pipe big enough for me to squeeze inside. It provided refuge and shelter from the beast. But it was ravenous. It was furious and ferocious. It gnawed and clawed its way into the pipe, slicing and ripping chunks of it away effortlessly. I was forced to slide myself deeper inside without any idea of where it might lead. Then the pipe turned downward and I fell. The pipe did not bring me to the sewers, of which I was grateful, but it did drop me into a pile of ravaged corpses with flayed skin. A single industrial light swung next to the pipe, emitting a low, buzzing resonance and dimly lighting the room. I couldn't say where I was for sure, but it appeared to be a factory of some kind. However, its purpose escaped me. That's when I noticed the webs. Not the webs of a spider. Well, not a spider you would find naturally. These webs were made from the intestines and sinew of the bodies I laid on, stretched so finely you may think it was flesh-colored silk. But the nefarious arachnid that spun them held a greater fear in my bones, for I could not see it, nor did I sense its presence. Perhaps I was in luck, and it had gone searching for more unsuspecting remnants of humanity. No, of course, I would not be so fortunate. The skittering of many legs invaded the room with fervent need. I tried to crawl under the bodies, but I was too slow. Without warning, I was scooped up and hoisted into the air by something horrid. It was a giant spider, with human body parts intermingled with its exoskeleton. The prickly hairs you would normally find on an arachnid this size were instead fingers. Its body was covered with human skin, and all of its eyes were human as well. A fleshy, raw spider of human make, weaving the sinews of human meat and muscle for its web domain, and it seemed to be looking at me as its next victim. It began tearing off bits of my clothing, leaving holes in my shirt. I used what little movement I had to fend off its intrusion, knocking the human arms it bore on the sides of its malignant head away as they tried to cling to my flesh. I could sense it was growing angry by my obstinate behavior, but I wouldn't succumb to its wicked nature so easily. The mannish spider brought one of its legs near my chest as if it were going to impale me, but I acted fast, grabbing the leg with both hands and snapping it in two. The spider shrieked like a banshee and sent me hurtling to the viscera-covered floor below. It writhed and screeched unabated as I tried to regain my composure before it descended upon me with a righteous vengeance. I managed to find my feet and ran out the nearest doorway. It led to a long, blood-stained hallway that was barely bright enough to navigate. At one point, I tripped over a stray pile of spinal columns and stumbled forward, but I was able to keep running. The spider was crawling after me, and its legs were clicking against the floor like chattering teeth. My heart nearly left my chest when I glanced over my shoulder to see how close it really was. Mere feet away, and my legs couldn't move any faster. But just ahead of me was a saving grace. The now all too familiar orange glow was shining through a section of the hallway I was quickly closing in on. As I reached it, the spider stepped into it only to be burned by the light, and it reeled back with an awful cry that rattled my eardrums. Through the rays of visible light, I could see small particles of dust gently floating in the air, and the spider began to retreat. Clearly it knew it would not be able to acquire me for its morbid collection. The light stemmed from a cracked opening in the ceiling. Mangled iron bars were bent down into the hallway, allowing me to climb once again into the infernal dreamscape, my painted world of rust. I wasn't far from the building I desperately sought to enter, and as far as I was aware, the beast that had chased me had gone elsewhere. Still, to be safe, I walked with great trepidation, careful not to make a sound. The world felt so empty now. Not that it didn't before, but this emptiness was something entirely new. Almost like I was the last living human in a fragmented world of perpetual loneliness. I eventually reached the building and found a door inside. I looked around cautiously before entering, and when I did, I moved as silently as possible. But the nightmare had only just begun. Upon entering the building, there was one way to go, and that was by way of a staircase ascending into some unknown upper floor. I sensed dread up those steps. I felt an all-encompassing aura of doom. But even still, something within me compelled my body to keep moving. It told me that the end lied with whatever existed beyond the threshold in front of me. My ascent was arduous and tedious. I felt exhausted and torn between whether I should go back and let myself be overtaken by one of those creatures so that I might wake up. My resolve was strong, though, and I wouldn't allow myself to be beaten down by my own thoughts. As I reached the top of the stairs, the room was revealed. It was palatial in appearance, a trick room of sorts where the inside is much bigger than it seems from an objective view. It was like I had been transported to a regal throne room. However, I was not prepared to be met with the immensely powerful sight sitting in the middle of the room. Two beings, both drastically different in appearance, but they were sat across from each other at a tall stone table, as if in deep debate. I stopped walking the moment my foot found a creaky floorboard, which made my presence known. The two beings turned to face me and beckoned for me to approach.
"Come, frail thing, witness our discussion,"
said the being closest to me with a low, rumbling voice. It was lanky, with skin like dark, dried meat. Its two arms were so long that its knuckles rested on the floor. It wore no clothing, although its head had an arched crown of sorts that went perpendicular to the curvature of its head.
"Yes, do come in. The room feels lively when guests are present,"
said the second being. Its voice was like an old man's, strained and rough. This being was wearing a mask speckled with the very same orange dust from outside, and it was equally as tall, though it was not an elongated being, in fact. This one was muscular, hulking, and domineering, with skin shimmering like oil in water. Their stature was incredible, and their forms lorded over me like gods. I found myself at a loss for words, completely unable to voice my opinion on the matters at hand because their sheer existence created a pressure I had to wade through like muck.
"You there. Did you see the flame?"
asked the first being. I looked in the direction its gangly finger pointed to see a small candle flickering in a non-existent breeze.
"That candle represents the fate of the world. Tend to it, would you?"
Tend to it? I asked through clenched teeth.
Yes,
began the second being.
assure that the flame is not extinguished, or it will mean the end of all.
But surely the world is already over, I questioned while doing my best to maintain movement. The first being turned to face the other.
"Perhaps it speaks the truth."
How can we be sure?
Inquired the second. The first being turned its gaze back to me.
"What is your proof?"
I was bewildered that it would ask me such a thing. The state of the world outside these concrete walls was proof enough. Have you not seen? The sun is blotted and the blue of the sky has turned to orange. Dust falls all around us. Ruin reigns supreme. What further evidence do you need? By now I had reached the candle. Its lit wick was tenuously struggling. The first being contemplated audibly.
"We see no problem with the world, and the way you described it seems natural to us. Is it not to your liking?"
My liking? No, the world I know is nothing like the one out there. My world is alive, while this one is corrupted.
But it is not corrupted to either of us, you see. We are thriving here,
remarked the first being. The second added,
Yes, it is truly paradise for us.
Suddenly, I remembered what they said about the candle and noticed its flame fading. I cupped my hands around it so outside elements wouldn't affect its dim splendor.
"Look at how it covets the flame,"
said the first being with a hint of joy. The second being began to laugh, and the first joined in. I don't see what's so funny, I snapped. There is no humor in the end of the world, and furthermore, why am I the one to guard this diminishing flame?
"Because you are the only one who can,"
said the first being, and the second nodded in agreement.
"Consider us harbingers of the end. You are a frail, insignificant entity in our eyes. But you are also the chosen remains of humanity's demise. Your hands cup the flame of life, but it would take less than a faint breath to snuff it out."
You mean to tell me that the world ends if I let this flame die? My shout shook the poorly flickering blaze, and my heart fluttered from the true gravity of the situation. That is, if what these beings told me was to be believed. Both beings nodded subtly.
Precisely,
they said in unison. I stood still as beads of sweat pooled on my face. My body began to itch from the combination of blood, dirt, and sweat that covered me as a result of my journey thus far. But I couldn't take my hands away from the flame. Fate relied on the strength of my will alone.
"So, what will you do? Will you let the flame die, or will you stay here with us for all eternity?"
asked the first being with an outstretched hand, although I dared not take it. I don't belong here. This isn't my world. This is a dream. My decisions don't really matter, I cried out as the flame flickered once more, sending my heart into my throat.
Is it not true reality?
asked the second being to the first.
"It does not know reality,"
suggested the first being. I interjected. I know reality more than either one of you. I live in it. My world is luscious and has many people just like me. It's nothing like this demented and twisted world you claim to speak of as true reality.
This is true reality. For us and for you. It's your choice on whether you want to admit it or not,
said the second being in a confident demeanor. The fibers of my spirit were being torn asunder. I didn't know what to believe, and each passing moment only pressed my psyche further into a state of abysmal indecision. And as I tried to respond, My words were stifled and my lip quivered. My letters were stuttered and the two beings noticed.
"Look at how it suffers,"
remarked the second.
Yes, it struggles to grasp the concepts we have laid bare,
added the first.
"Perhaps we should end its suffering for it,"
wondered the second.
Yes, I think our conversation has gone on long enough, and it is clear that it is weak,
said the first as it started to stand up from the massive stone throne it sat upon. Suddenly, I felt even smaller than I ever had up until this point. It was like the room stretched higher than structurally possible, as both beings were now beginning to rise. They collapsed on me and shoved my body aside like a rag doll before leaning in and blowing the candle out. Then, all went black. Am I still dreaming? I've awoken again, in the alleyway like before. I can't find a way out. If someone finds this, please help me. The sky is still the color of rust, and I can hear whips cracking and chains rattling in the distance. Thank you for joining Mrs. Nightmare's Storytime. I hope to meet you again.